We talk a lot about the traditional system of education being like a factory. Dad used the analogy. You can see why it makes sense that, you're in a production line and every teacher is responsible for their sort of contribution to the final product, and there are standardized tests along the way. And at the end, you kind of package up the product and ship it off the way, we group kids by age and they go through the same system regardless of who they are, with these systematic checks. But Dad had got kind of, in recent years, he'd moved away from this idea of it being a factory, because the crucial difference between a factory model and education is that children aren't inanimate objects. Factories create large quantities of inanimate objects. His feeling was that the correct analogy was an industrial farm. It's the mass production of living things. And his belief was that we're stripping our cultures and our people of our diversity of talents and of our, the very essence of what makes us human. And at the same rate, industrial farming is ravaging the planet and destroying ecosystems, and was created to suit a need at a time and has done that very well, but at what cost?
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess. The concept of the Spaceship Earth is simple. We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. Like a spaceship, we have a finite amount of supplies with an intelligent operating system, which keeps everything we need replenished as long as we all respect it and use wisely. So an understanding of how this system works, along with deep cooperation between humans and all life, is essential to keep us thriving and the spaceship flying. In this podcast, I'm in conversation with humans involved in regenerating life, shifting consciousness, and reimagining how we can live more beautifully and peacefully. I talk with artists, activists, writers, designers, adventurers, healers, entrepreneurs, creative mavericks, and more. Their stories invite us to participate in the co-creation of a more beautiful, life-sustaining world in service to life, becoming crew on the Spaceship Earth. Welcome to the podcast. This is Dan. Thanks for tuning in. It means a lot with so much stuff out there vying for our attention on the internet. I hope this finds you well wherever you are on Spaceship Earth. So welcome to episode 50. Episode 50. Hello. How did that happen? Well, there are actually nearer 60 episodes available, but that includes a mini-series I made during the first lockdown. But anyway, this feels like a special milestone, episode 50, and I have a very special episode guest to mark that. So in this episode, I'm in conversation with Kate Robinson. Now, Kate is co-founder of Imagine If and daughter of the late and so great Sir Ken Robinson. Now, if you don't know of Sir Ken, I encourage you to search YouTube after this and watch his TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity? It's the most viewed TED Talk ever, watched over 70 million times. Now, Sir Ken spent his entire life working in education and learning, initially as a teacher and then as an author, speaker and advisor. And his deep inquiry was around the critical importance of cultivating creativity and imagination in our children, in education and learning institutions, and increasingly across cultures. Kate followed this path and spent many years working with her father, Sir Ken, accelerating and mobilising this mission around the world until a sudden illness diagnosis early last year, which tragically led to his death a few months later. Now, Kate carries a deep sense of her father's spirit and has a brilliant and deeply thoughtful view of both the challenges and possibilities for imagination-led cultures. And now with her partner Anthony heads the Imagine If Foundation with a provocation to continue the work of Sir Ken Robinson, reimagining the parts of life we take for granted and that no longer serve us. Their mission is to help individuals and organisations understand and harness their innate powers of imagination, creativity and collaboration to recreate the world that we live in. Now, this was a beautiful, deep, honest and wide-ranging conversation which explored the last year of Sir Ken's life, Kate's relationship growing up with her father, her journey working with him and the legacy of his work which she is building on. We talked about schools, education, creativity, imagination, growing up and living in these times of enormous challenge, fear, grief, and yet so much possibility. Ultimately, this is an episode which explores humanness. It's an exploration of how our systemised and industrialised approach to education is stripping so many humans of their unique gifts and diversities. And as Sir Ken said, at the same time as we are draining our planet's resources, we are doing the same to our human resources. In times of increased complexity, we need more creativity and imagination to face into these times, not less. So let's cut to it. This is episode 50 of the Spaceship Earth podcast with Kate Robinson from Imagine If. So Kate, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
Thank you.
Good to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here.
Whereabouts are you on our Spaceship Earth right now?
In the world, we're in Windsor. Freshly in Windsor. Just moved 2 months ago.
Oh wow! How's Windsor?
It's lovely. We we were in London and moved out to Windsor partly because of the pandemic and partly because, as we'll talk about, Dad passed away in August. So we've come to sort of have the space and time to process our grief, and found ourselves at the site of the biggest funeral that's happened in the country for about 20 years. So it's not been quite the escape that we were looking for, but it is wonderful. I'm grateful to be here.
Well, thank you for having this conversation. And you've had quite a year, and I mean, we all had quite a year, but you've particularly had quite a year. So why don't we start with that, if that's okay? Maybe you could just share a little bit about what the journey's been like in the last year.
It's been a year. Yeah, I mean, I know you've had a year as well.
Yes.
But, and what a time to have a year. I do miss the days when what I was worried about was the pandemic.
Yeah.
There was a time when that was the most stressful thing happening. Well, yeah. So what happened in the last year? I say we is me and my husband Anthony, who I work with, who runs the companies that we have for Dad's legacy with me. Yeah. And we went back. So my parents lived in, so my dad was Sir Ken Robinson, and he and my mum, Terry, worked together next year would have been their 40th wedding anniversary. But they were together for 44 years. And like, you and Seema or me and Anthony, they worked together for all of it. So
let's dive into that one.
Yeah. It's a whole other part. But so they lived in LA for 20 years and decided in sort of the last, it would have been 2019, that they were moving back to England. So we started off 2020 in LA, packing up the family house and moving them back over here. So Mum and Dad moved.
Right at the start of the year.
Right in February.
Just before the whole thing kicked off.
Just before it kicked off. So we flew back. Anthony flew back before I did. I flew back by myself with Adeline, who was about to turn 2. So that was a fun 11 hours. But flying back, people were starting to wear masks and starting to... I remember I got told off by the cabin crew for letting Adeline walk around without shoes on. Because I sort of thought it can't be that bad. But, they were thinking the virus drops to the floor and if she's not wearing shoes. And so we came back and went straight. We sort of locked ourselves down, got back at the beginning of March, and then Mum and Dad flew over literally 3 days before lockdown was announced, and moved luckily they'd rented a flat next door to us in London. Right. So we were next door to each other, but because, do you remember at the beginning, you just didn't know if you could get it from sort of spontaneously. Yeah.
Letter through the letterbox. Everyone was weirding out. Or
even from... Yeah, when we were Detolling all of the groceries and you thought maybe you'd just get it if you weren't worried enough about it, or
bonkers. So
we didn't go and see them for the whole first of the lockdown, even though they were just next door. I dropped off groceries and kept my distance, and then Dad he started to get sick in April, but it was all contained. He spent May in hospital. We knew it was cancer, we knew it was cancer, the kind of cancer that most people don't make it to 6 months with. But they said the type of cancer he had was 2 people a year in the UK are diagnosed with it. Because, he had to be special in every case, couldn't do anything quite regularly. So 2 people a year were diagnosed with his type of cancer. It was the type of tumor it was, which they said meant that he'd be absolutely fine because it was such a rare kind. It was the kind of cancer that you wanted. So he spent May in hospital and then came out of hospital and was supposed to be getting better. Was supposed to have sort of a round of chemotherapy as belt and braces, they said, to make sure that, it didn't come back, but it would all be over by Christmas. He went for a routine scan ahead of it. And then we found out at the beginning of August that it had spread and that there was nothing else they could do. So he died 18 days after we found out that he wasn't going to be okay. So it was really that roller coaster of in and amongst the pandemic. He was in hospital for a month. We couldn't go visit him, and then sort of thinking you were working on getting him better and then suddenly not. But in that, in those 2.5 weeks we had with him, Anthony and I got married and Dad got to be there for that, which was, so it was a real lesson in how you can feel happy even when your heart is breaking. There can be light even in the darkest times, which was pretty incredible. So that was the first half of the pandemic. And then the second half has been suddenly fine. So Anthony and I, our company Nevergrey, we worked with Dad. We were his head office for the past 5 years. So we've suddenly found ourselves in the legacy business, which is, it's a new proposition really, is continuing his work, which I promised him that I would do.
So we'll get into that because like you say, you were going one way and now you're going another.
Yeah.
I guess there's a lot to unpack in that. And you've been very active since he left in terms of marking that legacy and the intentions that you have with it all. And we can explore all of that. I'm just curious to go back, if we can, and just explore a bit more your backstory. Just some more of the threads, if you like, of your story, the context. And obviously, your dad was Sir Ken Robinson, and to understand, what were, you lived abroad for quite a big chunk of time and just moved around quite a bit, just to understand more what the kind of seeds and things that catalyzed your journey. If we could start with that would be smashing. If you were up for that, of course.
I'd be very happy to. So I mentioned that Mum and Dad worked together. So Mum was a teacher and Dad was teaching at the time as well. And he was running workshops for teachers. His big passion at the time, and always, but was the arts and education, particularly theatre and education. And Mum was a drama teacher, which is how they met. So they shared this big passion together. Mum came from a teaching family, which you get teaching families. It's one of those things like doctors or lawyers, I think you sort of trace Mum's line back and there's a teacher every generation. But I mention it because I grew up in a house where the things Dad talked about, the issues he felt with the education system, the importance of the arts and education, of creativity and education, was a constant. It was the conversation over the breakfast table, the lunch table, the dinner table.
What was that like for you? As much as you can remember.
It's just normal, isn't it? Dad had polio when he was 4. And I didn't know until the week before he died that he was completely paralyzed in one of his legs. I didn't know till I was 20 that one leg was about 2 inches longer than the other. And I mention it just because it never crossed my mind to question it. Just when you grow up with something, it's how it is.
It's what you know, isn't it?
Exactly. And my bedroom, so when I grew up in Stratford-upon-Avon, my bedroom wall, I shared the wall with the bathroom, and I wake up in the morning to hearing Mum and Dad talking about it while he was having a shave, and she was sitting there sort of against the radiator and they were talking about it. So I think a part of it is osmosis.
Yeah. As you're talking about that, it's making me think about your dad's TED talk when he starts talking about Shakespeare's dad.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's it. We were from the village was Snitterfield, which is where Shakespeare's dad was from. Which is as he said in the talk, it's a whole new concept, Shakespeare having a dad.
Yeah, opens up a whole another world of possibility and questions.
Him being a person. So we moved to LA when I was 12, which I get asked a lot if that was a difficult transition. To which the only answer is that we went from a field in the Midlands to California. So not that difficult as far as I was concerned. It was, we swapped out the sheep in the field next to the house for a swimming pool. So
sounds like you were quite happy with the shift.
I was fine with it. Yeah. My brother wasn't. It was my brother was 16, and I think that's a much harder age to, you've got a 16-year-old, haven't you? Newly 16-year-old.
That's right. And he's just about to go to Canada.
I saw.
But that's his choice, not ours.
Well, exactly. So it wasn't James's choice to go. He had a girlfriend and had friends, and I think I had none of these things. At 12, I just started year 7, so was in transition anyway. But I went to a school in LA that was very elite, that was a former military school, and that was, a beautiful campus and state-of-the-art facilities, but whose primary purpose was to get kids into Ivy Leagues. And
how was that?
Just talking about transitions, the school I went to in England, I went to a few different schools in England, but they were all sort of, you sit on the floor in assembly cross-legged and stand up and sing your hymns, sort of English prep schools. The first assembly I went into in LA, they were playing Eminem over the speaker. It was in the basketball court and the students ran it. I was like, where are we? How is this school? But once the novelty wore off, it wasn't me. It worked quite well for my brother. And actually one of the things Dad always talked about is he did very well in the traditional education system. It worked for him. It does work for some people. But it did not work for me. And I ended up leaving. I got sick. I got glandular fever and left school when I came back. I'd been off for about a month and got kicked out of my first class 8:30 in the morning for not having read The Great Gatsby whilst I was sick. I may never read The Great Gatsby out of principle. I still haven't read it.
Slightly allergic at the mention of it.
Yeah, I may never read it. But I remember the day because I called my mum sobbing from the bathroom, as every independent 16-year-old does. And she stormed in with Dad and they took me out the school like knights in shining armor. And then we had this big discussion, about what to do. And, was I going to go to another school? Would I homeschool? We went and met with tutors and looked at all the other options for schools, and eventually
was this at this time? No, I was just wondering if was this? It's just interesting to know where your dad, like at this time, where his
head was at.
Yeah, basically where his head was at with all his whole view on education, schooling particularly. Just be useful to know at that time, was this deep in his work, so to speak? Because obviously for me, his TED Talks are my main reference point. So, but clearly there's they came from a lot of journeying.
Mm-hmm. So I left school in 2006 and the first TED Talk came out a month before I left school.
Oh, really?
But the reason you get to do a TED Talk is because you've been doing something. So he would tell a story about how someone once said to him, you've been at this a long time. How long has it been since the TED Talk came out? And Dad was like, I had a whole career before the TED Talk. It's why I got to do the TED Talk. So no, it had always been a passion of his. It had always been what he talked about. He wrote a brilliant book called Out of Our Minds in 2001, which he released 2 other versions of it. The latest, I think, was 2018, because it's a book about innovation and change. And, by the nature of writing a book of innovation and change, it outdates itself quickly. But it is just I've been reading it recently. It's a brilliant book. So this was, but I think the school that they sent me to, I think they thought, it had a theatre company, it had a dance company, it had state-of-the-art arts facilities. I think from the outside, it very much looked like it was going to be all the things
right.
that we
well, I guess that was my question.
Yeah, why send me to that school?
Yeah, right.
No, I get it. So I was never sent to the sort of local school in the hopes that it would all work out. And I remember the time spent going into which school we'd go to in LA. And as I say, it worked for my brother. It just didn't for me. And as soon as it became clear that it really was not working, they took me out. And so the decision to make was what to do next. And what we decided we'd do is that, they said, if you're in England, you could leave school at 16, so that as far as we're concerned, that's an option. I think if we'd known to call it unschooling at the time, that's what we would have called it, but we didn't know about unschooling at the time.
Yeah.
But that's what we did. And it was, I did, courses at UCLA Extension, and I went to community college. I worked for Miley Cyrus for a brief little while.
Brilliant.
So, listen, this is a story of privilege and support and opportunity, and having parents who are okay with you having unpaid internships. Yeah. Which not everybody has. In fact, very few people have, which is why it's a story of privilege. But I was very lucky enough to have it. And then through that experience, just got so. And then through part of that was helping Dad with the research for some of his books, or editing together videos of his for archives and things like that. And the more we talked about it, the more passionate I got about it. And then, I had the pleasure of working with him. So I used to, there's an amazing initiative called 100, which is a Finnish initiative that was started in 2015, because Finland was celebrating its centennial anniversary. I want to say in 2017, and I should know because for a long time my spiel was all about Finland's centenary, and I now cannot remember. I think it was 2017, it may have been 2018. The idea was to look at the future of education from Finland's perspective. And so I had my first task.
And the Finnish, in my sort of vague understanding of education, the Finnish have always been sort of a little bit on it in terms of education system innovation.
Well, they just seem to do it better.
Yeah.
They do things like value
less rules.
Yeah, they value. Children don't start school till 7. They value their teachers, which is a whole concept. Teachers have the equivalent of a master's degree before they start teaching, and the system's built differently. And so the reason it came to acclaim was because they aced the PISA tests a number of years ago. But what I found interesting is if you speak to somebody from Finland, they generally are kind of a bit baffled themselves. I don't think until PISA happened, they thought to really look at the way they were doing education. It was just the way that they did education. So my first task with 100 was to interview 100 education thought leaders on the future of education. It's kind of a dream job, got, to travel the world and speak to people about this. And it was also a crash course in what was happening globally in education. And then left that to start our company Nevergrey with Anthony and work with Dad. Amazing. Which was amazing. We had 5 years of being his head office. So,
and what sort of things were you starting to explore in those early years? What was the intention
with Dad?
Yeah.
Well, so the idea was that with the exception of Mum, and sort of various PAs over the years, he'd never had a team. It was all him. The business model was him, and the model of everything was him getting on planes and going and talking to people. And that, that just wasn't going to be sustainable forever. So the idea was that we'd come on board to help his message spread far and wide without him physically having to do it himself. We originally started calling it Project Legacy when we first started working with him. And he said it sounded like Project In Memoriam, and asked that we changed it. So we did. But so it was that really. We talked about, we looked at podcasts. We, helped with partnerships and courses and various things that, take a while to get off the ground and are still very much in the pipeline.
He was exploring, many things. But I guess, the starting point for many people with his work would be human creativity and where it rubs up against education systems. But he was very, very clear. I remember from that, in the TED talk, he was very sort of to this idea that, how can education systems as they exist today, how can they prepare us for a future that we have no idea what it's going to look like? Like, literally, we have no idea what's coming even a couple of years down the line. And now it's probably like 2 weeks.
Yep. Yeah, no one saw this year coming.
Yeah. So I guess with that, like, how his view on creativity in this context, he's very clear. His view is like, creativity should be is as important as literacy, and should therefore be treated with exactly the same sense of importance, prioritization in our education. So I guess I'm just curious, like, how did that show up for you in your life, these beliefs?
Well, so Dad's contention was that there are various misunderstandings around creativity. One is that it's for creative people, that you're either creative or you're not.
Which is still the case, really.
Yeah, still the case. The school that we went to look at this week, actually, the nursery teacher said, we were talking about nativity costumes, and she said, "Oh, I'm not creative, I don't sew."
Yeah, right.
But that doesn't. So you haven't learned to sew yet, is all you're saying.
Yeah.
That says nothing about your creative capacity. So that was that. The other, so it's either creative people or not. The other was that creativity is about certain subjects and certain activities. Whereas Dad's strong contention is that creativity is you can be creative in every single subject. In fact, you have to be. He defined creativity as the process of having original ideas that have value. And there were three parts to that. One was the fact that it's a process. And he talked about a process implying that there are various different aspects that are in dialogue with each other. And so for him, creativity was a dialogue between idea creation and idea evaluation. And you flip back and forth between the two constantly. You create an idea and then you try it and evaluate it, and that leads to an evolution of the idea, or a totally new idea, or throwing that idea in the bin and starting up with a new one. So those are the big kind of myths around it, that it's you're either creative or you're not, and it's about specific subjects. And his big point about it was trying to shake these myths off and help people understand that, as far as he was concerned, creativity and intelligence are blood relatives. You can't be creative without acting intelligently, and creativity is the highest form of intelligence. And there's a lot in that, in terms of, the neuroscience behind it and the way our brains work, and sort of the inherent creativity that is constantly there. He talked, and I love this, which we'll get to it later, but why we landed on Imagine If was what separates us out from the rest of life on Earth, because we are very similar, in many respects to all life on Earth. We rely on the earth to live. We flourish only in certain circumstances and completely disintegrate in others. But our lives are finite, and we start small and grow bigger. But what separates us is our capacity for imagination, the capacity to bring things to mind that aren't present to our senses. Creativity defined as sort of applied imagination. You can be imaginative all day and do nothing about it and make no difference, but creativity was taking imagination one step forward, and taking what's in your head into reality.
Yeah, I got a real sense from him that creativity, it's an active thing. It's embodied.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the other great bit in the TED talk about, from sort of teens, we're just sort of educating sort of up and up from the neck up into the head.
Yeah, and slightly to one side. Yeah.
Yeah, and I felt like that when I was at school. You could literally feel it. It was like this sort of intensity in the head. To grasp what I felt was sort of really abstract information, and ideas that we've been told to try and grasp and understand. Yet, some of us are just tuned in differently, like you say, or maybe approach things slightly differently, or spent time. But, ultimately, it felt to me from my memory of the school system is, like not within the body. The body was almost, forgotten.
Yeah. Irrelevant.
Yeah. And, creativity is this kind of dance often, and of expression through many, many forms. So we have this idea of educating into the head. It's quite visual when you start to think of it, isn't it? It's like,
yeah.
I remember, he told those great stories about movement, the need to move, and for kids. And, again, I guess when we're thinking about his work, I'm just thinking about now. And, again, he used to have this idea of this need for the personalization of education. And again, he had that phrase, every one of us has special needs, so to speak.
Yeah.
And what still blows my mind is that we live in this culture now where, if you look around, we're constantly, if you like, being told and enticed and offered these ways of becoming individuals, right? Everything now is like, individualize this, sort out your personalized diet and your exercise regime, what you look like on Instagram, all these kinds of things. Everything's about personalized. And yet education is still nowhere near to be seen, really, in terms of personalization. Why is that?
Well, there are some great examples of people doing it. There's things like big picture learning, which they break schools down into groups of, I think it's 13. I'm not sure there's any symbolism to the number 13 there, and I may have made it up that it's 13, but I'm pretty sure it's 13. And they call them an advisory group, and they have a teacher that's attached to each group. Mm-hmm. But they stay in that group for the whole duration of the time that they're at the school.
Right.
And the idea of that is that it's sort of an extra thing, but the teacher gets to know every child, because 13 is a manageable number, mm-hmm. assuming I'm right and it is 13. But it's a small number, so they can get to know each of their children in their group, and then tailor sort of learning towards the interests as they develop, and then they have opportunities for work placement at a certain point and kind of help them. But what I find, big picture learning is fantastic, and 100 actually has numerous examples of personalized learning and examples of it, but what they are, and they're doing a wonderful job of it, but it fixes the system as they are. Mm-hmm. It's sort of trying to, because in many ways the system feels immovable.
Right.
Dad's point is that it's a human-made system. All of our systems are, and the very fact that we created them means that there's the opportunity to recreate them.
Yeah.
Because they're human systems, they're complicated though. No one wants to take a risk with their kid. And there's sort of an element of better the devil you know, or I went through it and I'm fine aspect with it. But the bigger thing is that the systems was created for a time that was so different from the one that we know now. I think the majority of our systems are. And actually, I'm finishing Dad's last book at the moment. It'll be a manifesto, and the kind of core principle of it is that the systems that we've created are stripping us of our human resources and systematically stripping the planet of its natural resources. And we urgently need to address both of these issues.
Yeah, it's this industrial mindset, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. And
yeah. Well, I was just saying, it's just this call for something more organic. Yeah.
So Dad's point, we talk a lot about the traditional system of education being like a factory. And you can see why Dad used the analogy. You can see why it makes sense that, you're in a production line and every teacher is responsible for their sort of contribution to the final product, and there are standardized tests along the way. And at the end, you kind of package up the product and ship it off the way, we group kids by age and they go through the same system, mm-hmm. regardless of who they are, with these systematic checks. But Dad had got kind of, in recent years, he'd moved away from this idea of it being a factory, because the crucial difference between a factory model and education is that children aren't inanimate objects. Yeah, right. Factories create large quantities of inanimate objects. His feeling was that the correct analogy was an industrial farm. It's the mass production of living things. And his belief was that we're stripping our cultures and our people of our diversity of talents and of our, the very essence of what makes us human, and of our individuality at the same rate that we're stripping, that industrial farming is, ravaging the planet and destroying ecosystems and leading to, the high rates of antibiotic resistance and, kind of was created to suit a need at a time and has done that very well, but at what cost? And so there are 4 principles to organic or sustainable farming, and he felt that there could be 4 principles to organic education as well. That kind of, don't ask me what they are, because off the top of my head I can't remember. I could hear that question ticking in your head.
Kate, yeah, share those principles.
As I was saying it, I was like, stop speaking, Kate. You can't back this up because it's not in front of you. I can't, but there were 4 that it's in Creative Schools if anyone wants to read it. His book Creative Schools. But what the fundamental difference is that industrial farming, it focuses on these vast monocultures, and it strips the environment of so-called threats and predators, the insects that feed on them, in the interest of yield, of creating these sort of massive output of one type of crop. And in doing so destroys the insects that feed on them, and then the birds that feed on the insects, and everything. Whereas sustainable farming focuses on ecosystems and creates different plants different types of crop close together so that they can have this thriving ecosystem that helps them all grow. But I love this, the way he said it. He'd say that great farmers and great gardeners know that you don't grow a plant. You don't stick it in the soil and then super glue on the leaves and the petals and then sprinkle it with pollen. The great farmer or gardener creates the conditions, focuses on the soil, and creates the conditions for growth to happen. And he'd say that great teachers would do the same thing. You don't grow a child. You've got kids, after the first 9 months, once they're born, you're not actively involved in growing them. Your job is to create the conditions for them to grow into the best versions of themselves that they can be. And he felt that great teachers, great schools did that. They created the conditions for children to flourish.
Yeah,
so that was, yeah.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Again, you can apply this to so many things that are kind of broken now. This whole idea again of sort of, seeing things in a more system-wide way, seeing that like these are all about relationships and inputs, something that you do over here is going to have an impact over there, and starting to be able to see more in wholes, rather than seeing things as sort of separate. And I think gardening actually is a great analogy of our times, actually. Yeah. I think we need, more of that principle of of gardening in everything now, because it's trying to understand why certain things are happening, that we're now aware are destructive or problematic. You do that, in a gardening way, through observation, through listening, through looking, through trying to understand different things that are going on. And like you say, sort of adapting the conditions versus, destroying or coming in with a massive intervention. Yeah, it's so interesting. He was always very clear, at least as I understand it. Again, he saw that it was certainly not a teacher school problem. Here, it was a system that was really restricting so heavily, and obviously it got worse over time. Teachers and individual schools' ability to actually respond in the ways they wanted to. He was very clear, right? This model had been adopted globally, right?
That, and I love this. He said, rock and roll was not a government-led initiative. The real change doesn't happen behind closed doors in government offices. Real change happens from the ground up. And that, if you're involved in education, you're the system. If you're a teacher to the kids in your classroom, you are the system. They don't care about what's happening in Finland or, what GCSE results the 10 years ahead of them are doing. They care about what happens with you in your class. So if you change your approach, you are changing for the kids in your class. You are changing the system. Because you're right, it was never, and he was very keen, never to tell teachers what to do, because. I mean, how can you? First of all, they're the ones on the ground, and every class is different. Every group of students is different. Every circumstance is different. Which is the point. He'd say that traditional education as we know it, is designed around the concept of conformity and standardization, whereas life, is full of diversity. It's breathtakingly diverse.
100%.
And there's just, he'd moved away as well from sort of doing anything even vaguely government related for that reason. Because you you spend all this time talking to governments, and then the person you sort of maybe making headway with gets assigned to a different office, and you're starting from the ground with somebody else.
Yeah, sounds like working with business as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's about the people. It's about the people who are actually doing it, and that, you know, no one gets into teaching because they're looking to get rich or famous off it. You know, you do it because it's a vocation, because it's a calling. So you don't get teachers waking up thinking, how can I screw up kids today? Right. You know, what can I do to make sure that everybody leaves this school feeling like they've been stripped of who they are as a person? Yeah. It's just not how it works. It is very much the system that we've come to take for granted.
Yeah, he used to speak about this sort of stigmatization, if you like, of being wrong, of making mistakes. In his view, you know, he used to say, you know, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. But yet, in our schools and, you know, our institutions, business, you know, again, we stigmatize that. We don't create a culture of it's okay to, actually, you know, learning happens through failing. And so his view was, because of that, we're educating people out of their creativity, you know, because we're basically making it more and more terrifying for people to make the mistakes, right, that are completely, you know, necessary and unavoidable. You know, if you're going to flex your creativity, right, and, you know, you have to be able to just sort of, you know, do things and learn from them. It's funny. Yes, I was actually, my boy is sitting his GCSEs at the moment, and this week, well, some form of them, and he was just telling a story about, you know, someone that he was doing a bit of revision with, you know, a fellow pupil, and got a sense that they were, you know, just like not speaking up, you know, very, very reluctant to speak up in class because of, you know, all these things we're speaking to, and this whole idea that, you know, many kids are becoming silent in these in these classrooms, because in these sort of environments, and where does that lead you? Because, you know, they don't want to be seen to be stupid or make mistakes. So, you know, this whole problem, this whole culture sort of exacerbates itself, you know. And I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that. You know, what is it that might shift that, and, you know, is it already happening? I guess it will be in some places, but, you know, it's a big thing, isn't it? You know, you see it carry on in the world around us. You know, this sort of ridiculing of people if they don't know. You know, it's like in inverted commas, like what is it to know a fact anyway? But yeah, I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that sort of, you know, that culture of stigmatization, I guess, and, you know, it's coming through that failure is necessary, but, you know, there is no other real way.
Well, no, exactly. The it really is an idea that we enforce, isn't it, through the testing in particular, through, you know, there was a general, and this is why Dad was so great at names and I'm useless with them, but a US general, I think, who referred to the concept of how, rather than measuring what was important, we made what was measurable important. Right. So rather than, you know, checking to make sure that kids can think outside of the box and come up with original concepts, and we prioritize what's easy to test, you know, which for the most part is multiple choice tests where there's one right answer and for the most part 3 wrong ones, and identify which one is correct. Yeah, it's this output thing again, isn't it? You know, it goes back to what you were talking about with the factory farming. You know, you can say, well, you know, we've got X thousands of kids through on this grade, but actually what it doesn't measure is, you know, how many of them are struggling with their mental health or their well-being or what's going on at home. Yeah, right. I've got a good friend who's a superintendent in New York, and he failed the US version of the 11 plus because his dog died the night before. You know, and he had to go in the next day and take the test, and he just couldn't do it. And that meant that he couldn't, you know, it changed his whole trajectory of his life because no one cared what had happened to any of the kids. You know, they don't, what happens the night before a test. I think there's a big, and I hope the pandemic will do something about this, but I think sort of the move towards, you know, the rate of which technology is changing and the rise of AI, there's a big push to figure out what it is exactly that makes us human. You know, what does separate us out now that we're creating machines that can do a lot of the things that we're capable of doing. And I think you know, people working from home, for example, with the pandemic, and businesses now thinking, well, actually, do we need people to keep coming in? And people saying, well, hang on, I've managed to work perfectly fine and spend time with my kids and not saying it's been easy.
No, sure.
But people are sort of thinking, well, how much time do I need to spend commuting or sitting in one space? And when I'm actually capable of working differently. All that to say, I think we've got to such a point where we've done everything we can through our systems to ignore the fact that we're humans. You know, you're supposed to show up for work pretending that you're not feeling unwell, or that you've not had a big argument with your, husband the night before, or your mum's sick. You know, you're supposed to show up to school and face it regardless of what's going on. And actually we are, all of us, it doesn't matter what position you're in, we are all of us human. And that does come with make mistakes. And I think as soon as we start to, and I spoke to a group of people not long after Dad had died. It was the International Democratic Education Convention. And I wasn't ready for it, I'll be honest. I'd said yes to it in the 2 weeks after Dad had died, when I was superhuman and nothing could touch me because of the shock. And then by the time the thing rolled around, I think a month later, I was not superhuman. And I got onto this, thankfully it was over Zoom, but it was about 150 people from around the world. And I cried for about 15 minutes at them, and then opened it up for discussion so that they weren't all just sitting there watching me try and form a sentence through my tears. And it turned out to be this amazing thing of people talking about their own experience of grief, or how different cultures approach grief and loss. But the reason I mentioned it in this context, one person from Israel mentioned just what was so incredible about Dad was the fact that he was so human. And it struck me as such an odd thing, a beautiful thing to say, but such an odd thing that we would notice that about somebody when, part of why his talks caught on so much was that his thing was just get on stage and talk to people. And we've moved away from that now. If you're going to get on stage and do a talk, you have to have rehearsed it, and it has to be perfectly polished, and you can't make any mistakes. We do so much to try and forget the fact that we're human, and all of us the same. And I think as soon as we start getting our heads around the fact, and we'll have to, sooner rather than later, the fact that we are human, then we'll start realizing that making mistakes is just fundamental to it. And it's not about the mistakes, it's how you move on from it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, and what you're saying is just making me think. When we do show up in our sort of full humanity, extraordinary things tend to happen. Yeah. So it sounds like the Zoom conference was probably brilliant. Yeah, it was probably rich and deep and interesting because you showed up in your full, emotional self. Oh, I did. Yeah. That was mortifyingly so. But it's extraordinary, isn't it? What happens when we allow ourselves, when we're vulnerable, right, to show up. Exactly. Well, and it also, we do, just as a slight segue, we do grief so terribly in a secular environment in the West. I'm not religious, and it struck me when Dad died that my mum's family's Catholic, and what happens when someone dies and they're Catholic. You sit with them for the first 24 hours to make sure that the soul doesn't escape. You cover the mirrors, you have a wake, you have a funeral, and then a month later you all get together for the month's mind. And there's this big community that comes together when someone dies. If you're Jewish, you sit shiva, and there are foods that you eat, and there's a whole process to it. And what I found from this conversation I had with people, there was a woman from Nigeria talking about how in her culture, when she found out her dad had died, she started howling, and everyone ran out, and they knew because the way she was howling that someone had died, and they gathered around her. Someone in India was saying about how they scatter sesame seeds in water and watch them float away to symbolize the process of letting go. And we just don't have any of that over here. Right. It was so, there's 2 weeks between someone dying and the funeral, and nothing happens in that time. And that's another way that we forget or actively sort of ignore the fact that we're human. Everybody goes through it at some point. We will all die. We will all know somebody who will die, but we don't talk about it at all until you're facing it, and then you have no idea what to do with it.
We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. How bonkers is that? You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
That feels, again, as you're speaking, it's sort of taking me more to this sort of industrial mindset, again, of control and not showing...
Making people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. Not showing your vulnerability. Exactly. Again, it's almost a rejection of the messiness of being human and all that can hold. And again, when I think of the school thing, I've seen it with my own kids going into the school system, and again, no criticism to the school they're in. They're doing an amazing job, but you can see as they get older, you can see the walls coming up, in terms of what they feel they can share within a school environment. Even close to the gates, you can see things. Conversations shift. They'll become quite sort of edgy. It's just so interesting how. I think you're right. I think it's our humanness actually that's almost being sort of constrained here. It
is, and I mentioned I'm finishing Dad's book. In reading the draft that he left me to finish, what really has taken my breath away with it is that as much as his work is a criticism of the systems, the education system and other systems, more than that, it's a real love letter to human potential. It's a real testament to his belief in what we as a species are capable of doing if we fix our systems and we embrace fully what it is to be human. Because if you look at what we've done as a species so far, it's breathtaking. Our systems of language, of culture, our civilizations, our democracies, our works of art. That no other species does this. we do it. And that's what really strikes me about his work. As much of it being a criticism, it really is a celebration. It's a, come on, we are better than this.
Yeah. Again, I mean, just from my observations, he was always projecting the possibility of what could be,
Exactly. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about, obviously it sounds like things moved very fast last year for you guys, but did you get a sense of how the pandemic affected him? And I ask really because I think particularly when we look at education and schools and this kind of shutting of schools everywhere and children coming home and obviously again, for some that was a complete nightmare and for all sorts of reasons and for others it was probably wonderful. But in terms of disruption to an education system, we've never experienced anything like that.
Yeah.
Did he ever speak to that? And did you get a sense of what he hoped might emerge from these times?
Well, so there are two aspects of it. One, we did a podcast with him called Learning from Home during the first lockdown, and we cut it short because he got sick. But he spoke to various families around the world about their experience of a crisis schooling. One woman referred to it as, because it wasn't home education. It sort of does homeschooling a huge disservice to refer to this as homeschooling. It was schooling in a crisis from home. And what really struck him about it was the examples where people were actually thriving was when they weren't trying to directly replicate what the school systems were doing. Families where they were embracing cross-curricular learning and learning different things through different ways, but particularly ones where they were embracing cross-age learning and having the older siblings help the younger siblings. And it was, as you said, it was different for everybody. We spoke to a woman in Utah who has 4 kids. One of them's 17 and the other one is 6. The youngest one's 6 and everything in between. So she's there trying to help one of them with their college entrance and all of that. And the other one's too little to be able to read properly on an iPad. And she was working part-time and also studying herself. And that's where sort of embracing just doing things differently, not trying to sort of set up a chalkboard at home and try and recreate the classroom as they thought it was, but actually sort of trying to make it work for them, was where it really made a difference. But the second thing to say about it, he did a thing in, I always get it wrong, I want to say March of 2020, called the Call to Unite, which was organized by Tim Shriver. It pulled together various people talking about uniting through the pandemic. And his whole point was, we've pressed pause on our social systems. It's time to hit reset on them as well. Let's not race back to the way things used to be. Let's take this opportunity. This has never happened before. Let's take this opportunity to really reevaluate which parts of life it is that we are racing back to. And there's a wonderful guy called Ted Dintersmith who talks about, rather than this being a lost year for education, what if it was a found year? What if we took this opportunity to rebuild and restructure? And I think we're at a tipping point with it where it could go one of two ways. It could either go with people saying, well, let's get back to basics as soon as possible and really focus on the testable things, because we've got to make sure these kids get up to, catch up with where they were, and we lose the opportunity. Or there's a chance to really do things differently. And, we've got what we've never had before, which is parents having looked under the hood. I don't know if you saw Michael Rosen did an article a few months ago about fronted adverbials, about no adult has really heard of a fronted adverbial, and he's a writer, so why are we putting so much pressure on our kids to know how to use it correctly in a sentence? I have no clue what a fronted adverbial is.
Yeah, honestly, on that note, I look at some of the stuff my son's doing GCSE. I have no idea what it is. And
he won't.
No idea.
He won't in a number of years either.
No, yeah, it's true.
So that was his hope, was that we have this opportunity, and we have parents having looked under the hood in a way that they haven't had an opportunity to do before, to question it. And we've proved that we can do things differently. So, his real wish was that we use this as an opportunity, that thing of flowers growing where there's dirt, take this awful situation and turn it into, find the positive in it, which is not little how awful it has been.
It strikes me, because, I'm often looking at, what next across so many ways of how we live and how we sort of organise on this earth. And it feels to me, as we're into this phase of, I don't know what it's called, what we're going back to, or what we're stepping into, or what's emerging from this process. But it feels to me, and it goes again to this idea, I guess, of what you were speaking about. It's down to people, real people in places. But it feels to me like there's also a need for resistance. There's a need for people to go, do you know what? I'm holding firm to this, whether I'm a teacher, or I run a business, or I work in the community, whatever it might be, because, the force will try and take us back, or slot us back into the machine again. Do you know what I mean? I think there is, some sort of resistance needed, I think, to want to be able to shift this.
I am all for mutiny. There's a brilliant book called Be More Pirate. That we've sort of based a lot of what we do on this idea of pirates picking something that they had an issue with, and taking it into their own hands. They get a lot of bad press, pirates, but I agree with you. It's why these kind of Band-Aid solutions are papering over the cracks. If we try this little thing, you'll be able to get through exam season. I think we're so far past that. It's sort of the equivalent of the plastic straws.
Yeah.
If we all switch to paper, we think we fix the environment, and it's such a small aspect of actually what we need to do.
Yeah.
With it, I think the time has come. You're right, for the resistance.
Yeah, and it's interesting on that. Let's get into the imagination piece. Your dad's key, or one of his key messages, as you said earlier on, was what sets us apart as a species is our ability to imagine things that don't exist. Yeah. When you go to his TED talk, and I was lucky enough to do an interview with him. I think it was about 6 years ago, and that was looking at the bigger issues of our time, climate change, and issues of poverty, all these things. And he seemed to me always to be very aware of this kind of fine line between doing incredible things with this imagination, but actually that there's also a very fine line into doing quite destructive things, not necessarily intentionally, but it's almost like this superpower imagination, almost.
Yeah.
And so could we chat a bit to that? Because it seems like he was very aware of the kind of issues that were building up, that we're now obviously experiencing everywhere.
Well, if you think of every aspect of life, we didn't inherit a planet with these big structural cities, and he talked about Las Vegas, about how there was no need for Las Vegas. Not that it wasn't a wonderful place, and he and Mum renewed their vows there for their 25th wedding anniversary at the Elvis Chapel. But it just being this example of sort of almost pointless human creativity. But if you look at everything, like I said, from our works of art to our buildings to our symphonies to democracy to our language, and then you also take all the terrible aspects of it, all the wars, all the cultural battles, all the horrors, they're as much a product of creativity and imagination as the good things. And you can't sugarcoat that and pretend that imagination is wonderful all the time. You know, people do horrific things with their imagination. He put, it's in this book that we're writing, he wrote that, you know, our powers of creativity have brought us to a critical pass. But his strong feeling, his solution to it was not that we need less creativity, but more. He said the more complex the issues of the world become, the more creative our solutions need to be to resolve them. And that it's about educating us around our creative capacities and using them for good. But he'd also become increasingly concerned with the environmental crisis. You know, and he referred to it as these twin crises: the crisis of the Earth's natural resources and the crisis of our human resources, and how our systems are draining us of both. And that there was very little point in planning for a future if we're not going to have one on the planet, and then the role that education has in that capacity. And that creativity is pivotal to it, because you're right, you know, industrial systems of farming and industrial systems of education came out of someone imagined it and created it. But the beauty of it, as he put, is that we create, you know, we don't live in the world as other creatures do. We create the worlds in which we live, and that the human world is born as much out of our minds as it is from the natural world. You know, we create these systems. There's a quote from, I'm going to forget who it's by. I've forgotten who it was, but who said that we're suspended in webs of our own. We're suspended in webs of importance that we ourselves have spun. Something like that. That, you know, we've created these systems and attested values to them, and therefore, you know, we create the worlds in which we live.
Yeah.
But there is always a possibility for recreation. Is the beauty of it, and I think that's the message that, you know, when talking about his legacy and the work that we have to do, I'm very keen that it's not a looking back. You know, he got sick and died. He wasn't at the end of his life. So people said rest in peace. It never seemed quite right, because he had no intention of dying when he did. You know, and there was this whole new chapter of his work. And as far as I see it, our job now is to carry forward that chapter, you know, not just sort of put a full stop on him and create a few awards in his name and, you know, and maybe a foundation, although we are also doing that. It's about continuing his work and steering us through this incredibly difficult period of transition that we're in.
Yeah, let's talk about Imagine If. Yeah. Maybe just can you just give us a bit of a story about it?
I can. So imagine if we did a big event for Dad's birthday on the 4th of March this year, which 2021. I still think it's 2020. It seems very odd that next year is 2022. Yeah. And the idea behind it was severalfold. One was to kind of come together publicly for the first time and say, you know, he passed away. Let's mark that. But it was more so a kind of rallying cry to everybody who was inspired by his work to say, you know, if he lit a spark in you, it's time to fan that into a fire and continue his work. It's, you know, I'm aware when I talk about his legacy that, well, a few things. One, that if I did nothing, it would continue. You know, his legacy is not dependent on me for it to continue. He created an incredible legacy himself. So the second is if I'm going to get involved in his legacy, I've got a really big job to not screw it up.
No pressure.
You know, not sully. No pressure at all. No, you know, not sully his name when he's not here to defend himself or kind of clarify. But the third is that we're not doing it alone. You know, he inspired a movement of people who were as dedicated as we are to continuing his work. So that was Imagine If and it came from this idea of we've created the world, we can recreate it, and quite frankly, we really need to at this point. It's getting urgent. So the idea for Imagine If is that it was this big event to mark his birthday this year, but it will be an annual event and it'll be an annual celebration of human potential, inspired by this idea of his work being a love letter to human potential. And it'll be a year-round campaign. So we have all these statements from people who came forward with Imagine If statements, you know, imagine if we did things differently. And so we're partnering with various organizations at the moment to move the needle on them. So a lot of them are actually to do with the environmental crisis. A lot of them are about education, obviously. And it's about partnering with the right people to take it from imagination into reality, because that was his big point. You can sit around all day being imaginative, and not doing anything. But, imagination and creativity are not the same thing. You have to do something. It's not enough just to imagine. You have to do something.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it strikes me, some of the things I've been looking at in the last year or so is sort of more inquiry-based ways of working, where you're imagining and then you're acting. So you're experimenting on that to learn quickly, to test something. Yeah. And that can be as simple as doing things, in your life, it could be within your home, you want to shift something, how do you do that? But then it obviously goes out into a wider world, like community and beyond. But the whole idea that exactly it's feedback loops, they're cycles of inquiry. It's not enough just to dream or just imagine. No. We have to go and then do something with that knowledge or that idea in order to understand the feedback of it, its potential, or again it could be negative as well. And I think that's such a big shift though, isn't it? Again, that's not how we're taught. There's a sort of passivity around education in some ways.
But there is, we spoke to, I sort of went to look at a school for Adeline, and the head teacher is very big into coding, which is great. But she was saying, her job is to make sure that kids learn not so much what they're coding, but sort of the skills involved in learning to code, because, the world that they'll inherit, the coding will have changed so much by the time they get out into the world that what they learn now will be outdated and irrelevant. And I sort of corrected her on it because she's totally right, of course, but that also these are the ones who will be redefining the coding.
Right.
They won't just be shaped by it. They'll be the ones shaping is the goal of it. If we're raising our kids correctly, they're not just inheriting a world, they're leading a world. We're raising the next generation, not just to live in the world as we've left it, but to leave their stamp on it and to, guide the next generation through it. There's a really lovely phrase Dad used in the book, which is creativity is call and response. So one idea, to your point, you have an idea and you test it, but you don't know what's going to come of it.
Right.
He talked about how Gutenberg had no idea when he invented the printing press that it would lead to the Protestant Reformation, because he'd made something possible, and that could then create something to spread like wildfire. In the same way that the guy who invented the IQ test had no idea that it would kind of become synonymous with intelligence however many hundreds of years later.
Sounds like the guy who invented GDP. He would have no idea that everyone would inherit that as a metric of success globally, which was never intended to do. He was like, no, don't use this to measure success of countries.
But it's the same with education. The PISA tests weren't really intended so that that standardized testing would become the be all and end all. It was sort of supposed to test the water. But there's a positive side to that. When the iPhone came out, they couldn't have anticipated the types of apps that people would create, or the entire industry of app creation that they'd be creating. I guess the point is when you come up with an idea, to your point, with this kind of process of the play between idea creation and then idea evaluation, you have no idea when you put something out into the world what will become of it.
Yeah.
And just how important that is.
There's two things that sort of come up for me when we're thinking about the Imagine If work you're doing. I'm noticing probably really in the last year, actually, or maybe even less, but there's a lot more, it feels like there's a lot more conversation going on around imagination. I've been doing a couple of projects myself, exploring kind of collective imagination of communities. And what's been interesting, I did this project down in Bath called Dreamspace, which was, again, looking at how people look at the problems within a place, but also giving people the opportunity to imagine how they might, evolve those problems, address them, serve them. And actually, one of the funny things that kept coming through, people aren't used to be asked to use their imagination in a sort of positive way. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like we'd love you to imagine. Yeah. And again, maybe it's a little bit like, it might be a bit like your dad's idea of being creative. I wonder if sometimes, people think, I don't have an imagination. Do you know what I mean? It's for those that are kind of, more, I don't know if that makes sense. Sort of, people not like me kind of thing. It's all sort of like
It's slightly whimsical and things, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's this idea of it being almost stigmatized, sort of away with the fairies.
Yeah, exactly. And then this other piece that's coming up that I'm starting to hear and come across of late is this idea of moral imaginations. And it's kind of like, what do we actually do? I guess, what we've just been speaking to, it's like, because the imagination is, there is, it's powerful. There is so much power in how we can reimagine and the things that we can create. But in a time of so much complexity and urgency, and the need to sort of stop so much of this kind of destruction in the world, it's almost like, well, what is the role of this of our imagination, of these powers, this kind of moral imagination in the future? It does feel like this work that you're really pushing through with now. It feels like if there was ever a time, it's
this is it. Well, that's one of the cruel things about the timing of Dad's passing away, is I really think there's never been a more important time for his message.
Yeah.
That idea that the more complex the problems of the world become, the more creative we need to be to resolve them. They're freaking complex at the minute.
Right. Yeah.
They're massively complex, the issues that we're facing. And there's a great neuroscientist called Dr. Amir Ahmedi, who he did work with people who were born blind, to kind of reverse engineer ultrasounds and to help them see through sound. So the way an ultrasound takes sound vibrations and turns them into images, he took images and turned them into sound vibrations. And sort of through this 48-hour intensive training, a person who was congenitally blind could come and sit down and pick the one green apple out of a bowl of red ones because of the system that he'd created. What he found through these brain scans of people who were blind and people who weren't is that he did brain scans to see, so people who could see, to look at an apple, and scanned which part of the brain lit up when they looked at an apple. And then the next scan was imagine the apple, and a different part of the brain lit up. Huh. So he's identified through this work where imagination happens in the brain, and it has its own special bit. But also what he's found is that everyone has different capacities for imagination. So he, for example, has a really hard time with visual imagination. He can't bring images to mind, but he's got sort of almost perfect recall of music. He's got a really strong music imagination, which is it's another one of those things. Dad always talked about how, we take our senses for granted. We assume we've got 5 senses. But actually we have so many more than 5 senses. We've got a sense of temperature. We've got, it's not just about sight and touch and taste and smell and what's the other one?
Yeah.
Sound.
Yes.
But we've got a sense of temperature. We've got a sense of balance. We've got countless amounts of senses that we just completely take for granted. And we take it for granted because we've been told so many times that we have 5 senses. We've never thought to question all the other ones that we have. And I think imagination is an interesting one that we assume when we're talking about imagination, we're all talking about the same thing. But it's one of those ones like, how do we know we're all talking about the same red? We all have different capacities for it, which I just think is fascinating.
Yeah. And it feels like, and I'm sure there's probably like data and research and stuff, but it feels again like it's a practice, right?
Yeah.
It's a kind of muscle, or, like the more we're able to,
the more we use it.
Yeah. To practice
the beauty
and explore.
of the placidity of the brain.
Yeah, right. Explore our own imagination.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which brings us back, like, if to where we started, like the younger, it's there. Imagination is rife in these, in the young years. Yeah. And what we could be doing to keep cultivating that, and seeing that, like your dad's thing, it's as important as literacy, and rather than, mandating and forcing everyone into kind of, strange algebra and whatever. I'm not sure these things are useful, but, surely now, like you say, what we're facing into as a species, we're all different. But it just feels like, that's the one thing I think that just feels, to me at least, seeing, my own small experiences, my own children, just to be able to keep questioning, to keep being curious, to keep thinking, how can I do this, or why can't that happen, or how do I try this? Just that. Do you know what I mean? That sense of openness, of possibility, of curiosity, because everything else. We have no idea. There is no certainty where any of this is going.
No.
So the ability to sort of just being able to overcome something through an idea or a behavior or just a way of shifting, constantly being able to shift your views and adapt, I guess, is really what maybe is what we're looking at.
It's maddening, isn't it, as well, that education happens when it does. Because, when kids, it from languages, there's a certain point when it's harder to start learning a language. Whereas if you're exposed to languages at a young age, you can speak those languages. And these, 12 to 13 years that most kids go through at school happen at a point when their brains are so mushy, and it's so pivotal what we expose them to during that period. And actually what tends to happen is we spend those 12 to 13 years shutting off various aspects of it, and then the rest of our lives trying to open them back up again.
Yeah, right. I've always thought that with things like yoga and meditation.
Yeah.
We get to our 30s and 40s, and everyone starts breaking down because they're losing the plot with how crazy life is. Yeah, and then we try and discover all these things like yoga and mindfulness and whatever it might be to try and
at the time
deal
when we
with
can't
it.
touch our toes.
Yeah, exactly.
Right when our hips are closing up, we discover yoga.
Yeah, and like anything to try and cope with the mayhem.
Yeah.
If we had that, when we're younger, or we're able to sort of have these kind of tools and practices, which are, actually about having agency, right? Because they're all things that help you deal with the complexity of life, without having someone to tell you what the answer is. Do you know what I mean? It's like all of these things feel so weird that we sort of strip them all out, and then we get the sort of midlife crisis, and we're all going, oh shit, it's like why didn't no one show me this stuff when I was a kid? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I have two things to that. One is I've been doing the Nike Running Club app a lot recently because now we're in Windsor and there are fields to run in. And Coach Bennett, who's the coach of it, talks about how there's never just one starting line. You can have a starting line at any point in a run. And he says, he talks about, he says it a lot in the runs, but he says, I'm talking about running. I'm also not talking about running. Yeah. Which is true because, the way it is this kind of conveyor belt method of it, but we assume that we get to a certain point, our learning's done, and we carry on this trajectory, and it's just so wrong. Yeah. And the other thing to say is that I sit on the board of Goldie Hawn's Foundation, and they're the sort of leading program they have is called Mind Up, which is it's mindfulness for kids in schools, and they teach kids things like how to take a brain break, how to just sort of take a step back and breathe and process something, or they talk about, rather than punishing kids, with sort of timeouts or taking things away, having them create a safe space where they've got pictures of people they love and, things that are comforting to them, and having them go there to pull themselves together in a safe space. Because the other thing we do a very good job of is penalizing kids for having emotions that we take for granted we have as adults.
Right.
Any of the negative behaviors or any of the processing, we don't allow our kids. I say this as the mother of a 3-year-old who was processing a lot of emotions, but it's easy because it's an inconvenience. It's easy to say, stop shouting or. It's sort of going back to command and control again, doesn't it? It's like it's kind of like you're disrupting the system here, again. Whereas actually, if you're going back to looking at the individual, it's allowing them to. Well, I guess it's about trusting them as well. I guess Well, yeah, trust is a really big thing. It's a huge aspect of it. We do such a good job of telling kids that they have no voice, that life starts at 18. And it just doesn't, I don't know anybody who discovered the UN rights of the child until after they were a child. We don't in school sit the kids down and say, you do actually have your own rights and your own, there are things that you can do as a kid. It doesn't serve us as adults to do that because, then they start doing it and breaking the systems we've worked hard to preserve. But I think myself, that's the ultimate grassroots revolution is is young people, is getting kids as pissed off about this education system as we are as adults. There was a great book by a guy called Nikhil Goyal called Schools on Trial. And I think he wrote it when he was about 18. And what I love about it, he's so angry that he's just gone through the system. It's not polished the way that the adult written versions are. He's not sort of taking into account the sensitivities around it. He's just angry about it. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, this just makes me, my own example of watching my boy at the moment. I mean, he's getting through it, and he's doing what he can, and he's doing a great job. But he's angry, and he's angry because he feels it's such a waste. Yep. It's such a waste of time and potential of people. That's what upsets him more. It's like how can we? He sees it as like enforcing this kind of system down on kids and teachers, because he sees the frustration in teachers. He's just like, why? He can't understand why. And again, we've probably never been in a position ever to design such extraordinary learning environments right now, right? We've got I don't know, there's
exactly.
There's content everywhere, there's ideas, there's practices, there's support systems, communities. You could reimagine this stuff. You could prototype new schooling systems coming out of lockdown. That feels like what we should be doing, right? Like, it's like, what's the new hybrid going to look like? There's so much potential.
There is. I mean, even things like there's a brilliant guy called Stephen Heppel, who's created a learnometer, which is a little machine that you put in the desk, and it reads things like the quality of light, the quality of air, the noise pollution in a space to tell you if it's conducive for learning. Because we don't take into consideration things like the very seats that we ask kids to sit in all day, every day are uncomfortable. And sitting in that upright position.
Yeah, sitting down, right? I mean, that's mad, isn't it? And lots of kids need to move.
Exactly, and
they can't sit down.
And that we ask them to sit in these dark rooms, or these rooms with fluorescent lights, and none of it. He talks about how when an elite athlete goes out to run a race or do whatever their sport is, they know what they're going to have for breakfast to make sure that they get the most out of their bodies that day. But we don't tell kids what to eat the morning of an exam to make sure they don't have a sugar slump or they get hungry halfway through it. We just haven't. And he's doing that research into learning environments, which is just amazing, because he takes them into offices as well, because we do the same thing in our workspaces. We create these spaces that are just not conducive to the work that needs to be done more often than not.
Back to the factories again.
Back to the factories. Exactly.
Yeah, your dad's theory.
Exactly.
He was on this.
Yeah. But just last thing, there are wonderful examples of people doing wonderful things. And actually, United World College is one of them. They do fantastic things. So it's exciting about going off to Canada.
I know, but that's what frustrates me. It frustrates me that it's not accessible when it could be. That's the thing that frustrates me. It seems to me, and of course there'll be loads of other brilliant examples of places within the system that are doing extraordinary things. But as far as I can tell, the most, the kind of most exciting stuff is just not accessible.
No, you're right.
Unless you
can afford it.
Exactly. You've got money, or, you've somehow been offered a place, or whatever it might be, but it's not for the masses. No. And it could so easily be, right? Yeah. That's the thing.
Well, and it's in the interest of the system to fix it. When you look at the price of the dropout rates, and as Dad would say, the dropout rates don't even take into consideration the people, like your son, who are just disillusioned by the whole thing and find it to be a waste of time, but are sticking it out. It doesn't take into consideration the cost of unemployment or the prison systems, or he used to say, if you design a system to do something, don't be surprised if it does it. And the issues that the system has at create longer term, and the financial implications even of that. If the thought of sort of this moral imagination, to your point, or this idea of doing the right thing by the kids isn't what gets you up in the morning, then the financial implications of the system not working are overwhelming.
Yeah.
But you're right. It would be in the perfect world, it would be easy to fix it. And as Dad would say, his work was never about theories. It was about things that we know work, and we know work because they are being done in these different settings. And you're right, they should be accessible.
Yes, let's make them accessible.
Let's fix the system.
Yes, imagine if So how can people get involved? What's going on? I seem to remember rightly as well when you did the launch, you had loads of content, right?
Good, 11 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I'll link out to all of this, but just going forward, is there anything you can share more about ways for people to get hooked into it?
Well, so we have imagine-if.com. So I haven't been on it for a bit because I'm writing this book. I was like, is it .org? It's definitely .com.
I'll put that in the show notes.
Thank you. Which is probably the best place at the moment. And we've established the Sir Ken Robinson Legacy Fund as well to continue his work. And there'll be information about that on the website soon as well. But at the moment, it's about, I've been using the email address skr@nevergrey.org. For people just to get in touch and say how they feel the best way to continue his work is, or to share the work that they're doing. Because I think the first steps that we'll be taking is about pulling this community of people together. Mm-hmm. And I had, after I did that talk I mentioned where I just cried, somebody sent a message afterwards saying they were so glad to hear they thought that because Dad had died, the work had stopped. The movement was over. And he would say it was so much bigger than he was. He'd say he wasn't the first person to come up with these things. That he was standing on the shoulders of giants, and it's our turn now to stand on his shoulders. So I think imagine-if.org and that email address skr@nevergrey.org. And don't be shy about getting in touch.
Amazing. Thank you, Kate.
No, thank you. This has been so much fun.
Yeah. So I was going to get to this question I always finish with on the Spaceship Earth podcast, and it's funny. It's making me think about the one and only conversation I had with your dad, which was, what was it? 2015, 6 years ago, I think. We were exploring the launch of the global goals, and he was doing the work, designing the world's largest lesson. And we talked a lot about climate change, and we talked a lot about ecosystem destruction and poverty and all the connections. And he was talking about how he was thinking about, helping kids see our planet as this living system. And he was talking actually about being in space and coming in and seeing this Earth, this speck of life in the universe. And it was just interesting because it's making me think of this metaphor that has gone on to inspire me so much, this idea of the Earth as a spaceship. And I just wonder now, this idea of becoming crew on Spaceship Earth, what might that speak to you right now here in 2021?
Stop, man, I think it's 2021. We'll never get over that. I think you've hit the nail on the head with it. I think it is about agency. It's about not seeing Spaceship Earth as a free ride, but it's about taking responsibility. We have one opportunity, we have one life to live, and we have one planet to live it on. And it's about taking responsibility both for our own lives and for the planet that we're all sharing on it. I was going to say, I'll put a full stop on that.
Love that. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kate.
No, thank you. This is great.
It's been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your stories of your dad. And, he's just an extraordinary human. And it was pretty incredible. It really was. Yeah. But the work carries on. Well, that's the best way. Yeah. Well, I wish you all the good vibes. Thank you. And definitely this wave of imagination is what we need. It's such an interesting moment now for this work you're doing. So, wishing you massive vibes and good energies for the work that is coming. Time to reimagine. Yes, indeed. We'll be in touch. Wonderful. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Kate. Such a beautiful human, and what a treat to learn more about the life and mind of the late Sir Ken Robinson and the work Kate is doing to build on his legacy and help bring forth the creativity and imagination revolution, which is so urgently needed right now to help us reimagine our ways of being and organising on this beautiful planet, but also maybe where our own individual potential and well-being truly lies as humans. If we could only allow and encourage, cultivate and normalise it, to dream, to express ourselves, to create and dare to be more empathic, beautiful, kind and curious for now, for the future, for ourselves and for all life. Just imagine what could be. If you like this podcast, please give us a review. It will take 60 seconds and it will help others find it, or just share it with those who you think might like it. You can sign up to the monthly newsletter, Becoming Crew. You can follow us on Instagram at thespaceship.earth. You can leave us a donation if you like, a price of a cuppa if you like this episode. You can do all that via the website, which is thespaceship.earth. I'm going to play out with a track. This one's from 1997. It's by a French act called A Reminiscent Drive. It was an album, awesome album called Mercy Street. And this track is called Life is Beautiful. And this version is a cheeky little bootleg version, an exclusive for the Spaceship Earth podcast. Take good care of yourselves out there. Until next time, peace and out.
One of my starting points for all of this is that we are, as a species, facing enormous challenges. But there are two things about them. One is that they are relatively recent challenges. Certainly climate change was not something that Shakespeare was going around fretting about, or that anybody who preceded the Victorians had on their mind. It never occurred to people that we might mess up the planet in such a way that we couldn't stay on it any longer. And the second is poverty. And some of the root causes, I think, are also the roots of the solution. The fact that we're creating them is really important, because human beings are the most creative species ever to live on the planet. And we haven't been here that long. The planet, when people talk about saving the planet, it's a slightly arrogant attitude, I think, in that the planet's been around for 4.5 billion years. It'll be around for another 4.5 billion years, as far as we can tell. As far as we know, the dinosaurs were around for 13 million years, and they didn't leave of their own accord. We've been around for about 150,000 years. I mean, as modern human beings. I mean, we were cooking for a long time before that, but modern human beings like you and me, like attractive, groovy people down there, you know what I'm saying? We've been around, so far as we can tell, for about 150,000 years. So the image I was using in the lesson is that if you were to think of the entire lifespan of the planet as 1 year, human beings showed up at about less than a minute to midnight on the 31st of December. So it's not long, really, and for most of that time there's nobody around, really. Far fewer than 1 billion people, far fewer. It took till 1800 to get to 1 billion. We're now approaching 7.5 billion, we're heading for 12 billion by the end of the century, according to who you listen to on population projections. So most of that's happened in the last 300 years, which is a beat of a wing, cosmically. And it's happened because we've got even more and more creative. From the Industrial Revolution on, our creative powers have simply grown exponentially, collectively. So we've transformed the circumstances of the planet. We are transforming the face of it. And the more of us there are, the more taxing these problems become, because we're being very creative but not very far-sighted about these things. Our reliance on hydrocarbon fuels, our methods of farming, our obsession with pouring chemicals all over the planet, the way we're messing up the oceans. What we're endangering is not the planet. The planet will recover. It'll shake us off like a rash, like we tried humanity, not so good. We're going back to bacteria, they were fantastic. What we're endangering are the conditions of our own survival. So that's a really big issue, it seems to me. Are we now putting ourselves at risk as a species and all the other species with it? And a collateral piece of that is, or a complementary part of that is that all of these efforts to exploit the earth and to better our own circumstances are being done competitively rather than collaboratively. And so we're creating these massive gulfs in the conditions in which groups of human beings live. There was I've often quoted it, but there's a thing on the BBC about how many people can live on Earth. It was a documentary presented by David Attenborough. It was called How Many People Can Live on Earth. The BBC is very good at titles, as you know. And they concluded that if everybody on the Earth consumed food, fuel and water at the same rate as the average person in Rwanda, the Earth could sustain a maximum population of about 15 billion people. So we're halfway there. But we don't all consume as they do in Rwanda. If everybody on the Earth consumed as much as the average person in North America, food, fuel and water, the Earth could sustain a maximum population of 1.5 billion. Well, we're at 7.5 now, so one projection is if the entire planet wants to live as we do in North America, which is where I am just now, and actually you could also say the UK, it's not so different. By the middle of the century, we're going to need about 4 more planets to make this work, which we don't have. So these two factors of the exhaustion of the resources we need, the way we're upsetting the ecosystems that we depend upon, combined with the unequal distribution of resources and wealth and circumstances among the 7.5 billion of us that there are, seem to me to be absolutely critical. And it's not like we've got forever to figure it out.